Desert Ghost and the Dying Gunslinger, Apache Angels' Forbidden Rescue and Devil's Cauldron, 1876. The sun was just beginning to rise over the rugged hills of the American Southwest, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. The river, swollen from a recent rainstorm in the mountains, rushed violently over rocks and through narrow channels, its waters dark and powerful. John Whitaker, a tall man with broad shoulders and rough hands, walked along the riverbank. He had grown up in these parts and knew every twist of the land, every hidden danger. But even with his experience, the river today seemed alive, angry, and unpredictable. John had been out early, checking on his cattle that had wandered close to the river during the night. The rain had softened the ground, and the cows were nervous, shifting their weight and mooing softly. He walked carefully, making sure each animal was safe, his eyes occasionally glancing at the river as if he could read its mood. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and wildflowers, but there was something else, a faint sound that made him pause, a cry that was almost swallowed by the roar of the water. At first he thought it was the wind or an animal trapped somewhere, but then he heard it again, louder this time, a human cry. His heart jumped. Without thinking, he ran toward the sound, his boots sinking into the mud. The riverbank here was steep and slippery, but he didn't slow down. As he reached a bend in the river, he saw her, a young woman struggling against the current, her arms flailing as the water tried to pull her under. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her eyes were wide with fear. She was fighting with everything she had, but the river was too strong. John didn't stop to consider the danger. He kicked off his boots, rolled up his sleeves, and plunged into the icy water. The current hit him like a wall, but he pressed on, reaching for the woman. He could feel the strength of the river trying to push him back, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving forward. Finally, his hands found hers, and he grabbed her firmly. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he doubted she could understand him over the roar of the river. He pulled with all his strength, fighting against the relentless flow, until he managed to drag her to a shallow area where the water was calmer. Both of them collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for breath. John's chest heaved, his arms trembling from the effort, but he could see she was alive. She lay on her side, shivering, water dripping from her hair and clothes. Her breathing was ragged, and her eyes, dark and alert, looked at him with a mixture of fear and wonder. For a long moment neither spoke. The river behind them continued to rage, but on this small patch of muddy shore, there was silence. Finally, John spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You're safe now." She didn't answer. Instead, she touched her chest, trying to catch her breath, and then looked at him, as if trying to understand what had just happened. He noticed that she wore simple clothing decorated with beads and patterns that marked her as different from the settlers in the town nearby. She was an Apache, he realized, though the thought barely crossed his mind. All that mattered was that she was alive. John helped her sit up and wrapped his coat around her shoulders. The cold air bit at them both, and the river mist made her shiver even more. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. She nodded slowly, though she leaned heavily on him as he helped her to her feet. Her movements were cautious, careful not to slip on the wet stones. John guided her along the bank until they reached a flatter area where the ground was drier. As they walked, John glanced at her more closely. She was young, perhaps in her late teens, with a face that held both strength and vulnerability. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and alert, scanning their surroundings as if she expected danger at any moment. Her hair, dark and tangled, hung in wet strands around her face. He noticed the small scars on her arms and hands, marks of a life that had not been easy. Despite everything, she moved with a quiet dignity that caught him off guard. Once they reached a safer spot, John set her down on a large rock. "You need to rest," he said. She nodded again, but didn't speak. John wanted to say more, to ask her name, to make sure she was okay, but he also sensed that rushing would frighten her. Instead, he offered her a piece of dried bread he had in his coat pocket. She took it slowly, her fingers brushing his for a moment. He felt a strange connection in that touch, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they had both faced and survived. The river continued to roar behind them, a constant reminder of how close they had come to disaster. John knew the water would stay high for days, maybe weeks, and the path back to her people was blocked by the swollen currents. He realized that she had nowhere to go right now and would need shelter. He offered, "You can stay at my cabin until it's safe." She hesitated, unsure, her dark eyes meeting his. Then, slowly, she nodded. John led her along a narrow path through the brush, careful not to startle the wildlife or lose footing on the slippery ground. As they walked, he tried to communicate using gestures and simple words. "Safe," he said, pointing to his cabin. "Food," he minded eating. She seemed to understand, though she remained quiet, her eyes alert, taking in every detail of the unfamiliar landscape. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun was higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty clearing. John opened the door and stepped inside, letting her enter first. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a fire already smoldering in the hearth. He set her down on a chair and stoked the fire until it glowed warmly. She watched everything carefully, her posture tense, but not hostile. John brought out a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Warm," he said, rubbing her arms gently. She allowed him to help, and for the first time he saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. He set a cup of water in front of her and gestured for her to drink. She obeyed slowly, taking small sips, then looked up at him again. He smiled, gently. "You're safe here," he said. She nodded once more, a quiet acceptance that this strange, strong man had saved her life and now offered protection. As the day wore on, John prepared a simple meal of bread and dried meat, which she ate cautiously. They sat across from each other, the silence between them filled with unspoken questions. He wanted to know where she had come from, why she had been in the river, and what dangers awaited her beyond the bank. But he also understood that pressing too soon could frighten her. So he waited, offering kindness and patience instead of words. By evening, the river's roar was softer, but still constant. John lit lanterns in the cabin, their soft glow illuminating her face. He noticed how the firelight danced in her dark eyes, reflecting both fear and gratitude. She had calmed somewhat, and he felt a strange warmth in his chest, a mixture of relief, admiration, and something he did not fully understand. He realized that this was not just a rescue. This was the beginning of a bond forged in the most dangerous of circumstances. As night fell, he offered her a bedroll near the fire. She accepted, settling down carefully. John sat nearby, keeping watch, listening to the wind outside and the occasional crack of the river against the rocks. He thought about the events of the day and how quickly life could change. One moment the river had been a deadly force. The next, it had brought two strangers together in a way neither of them could have predicted. Before closing his eyes, John glanced at her sleeping form. She was exhausted, but alive, and that was all that mattered. He felt a deep sense of responsibility and a quiet hope that tomorrow would bring safety and understanding. Outside, the night settled over the hills and the river continued its relentless journey, a reminder of nature's power and the fragile beauty of life. For the first time that day, both of them could rest, knowing they had survived, knowing that something extraordinary had happened. A life had been saved, and a connection had begun that neither law nor distance could easily erase. The next morning the sun rose slowly over the hills, casting soft light over John's small cabin and the surrounding valley. The river, though still swollen and powerful, seemed calmer than the day before. John woke early, as was his habit, and stepped outside to check the cattle. His mind, however, kept wandering back to the young woman he had saved, Naeli. He still didn't know her name, but it suited the gentle, determined way she had fought the river. He wondered where she came from, what dangers she had faced, and how she had ended up alone in the middle of such a violent flood. Inside the cabin, Naeli stirred from her sleep. She rubbed her eyes and looked around cautiously. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the soft morning light revealed the small, simple cabin more clearly. Everything here was different from her home in the mountains. The smell of cooked food, the wooden walls, and the warmth of the cabin were strange but comforting. She felt safe, though she was still wary. Being rescued was not something she was used to. She had always relied on her own strength and the teachings of her people. But John had been different. He had risked his own life without hesitation, and for the first time she felt that maybe, just maybe, humans could be trusted. John returned to the cabin with a basket of fresh water and bread. He set it down on the small wooden table and gestured for Naeli to eat. She hesitated, unsure if it was polite to take food from him. When she finally took a piece of bread, her fingers brushed his hand briefly. The touch was fleeting, but it left a quiet impression on John. He smiled softly, encouraging her. Slowly she ate, taking small, careful bites while keeping her eyes on him. They did not speak much. John knew only a few words in the Apache language, and Naeli's English was limited. Yet they found ways to communicate. A nod, a gesture, a pointed finger. These small actions carried meaning. They laughed quietly at their misunderstandings, sharing moments that did not require words. Each day, the silence between them became less awkward and more comfortable. It was a strange kind of friendship, built in the quiet moments of shared survival. After breakfast, John took Naeli outside to show her the land. He pointed to the hills, the cattle, and the river. "Safe," he said, pointing to the cabin. "Food," he added, pointing to the small garden behind the cabin where he grew vegetables. Naeli followed his gestures, her eyes bright with curiosity. She reached out to touch the plants, amazed at their delicate leaves and colors. John watched her closely, noting her grace and careful movements. Even in a world so different from her own, she moved as if she belonged. Days turned into weeks, and Naeli remained near John's cabin. The river was still too dangerous for her to return home safely. John respected her boundaries, giving her space while ensuring she was comfortable and protected. He taught her small tasks around the cabin, chopping firewood, gathering water, preparing simple meals. She learned quickly, and John admired her determination and intelligence. There was an unspoken understanding between them. He would protect her, and she would help him with what she could. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. They began to share more than just survival. John told her about his life in the valley, the hard work of ranching, and the loneliness of living alone. Naeli, in her own way, shared stories of her family, her people, and the lands she had known. Though she could not speak freely, she drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, showing mountains, rivers, and her tribe's village. John watched and listened, fascinated by the life she had lived before fate had thrown her into the river. Despite the calm at the cabin, danger loomed outside. The local townspeople had noticed the young Apache woman staying near John. Gossip spread quickly in small towns. and whispers soon reached the ears of the authorities. John and Naeli were careful not to draw attention, but it was impossible to hide completely. The law of the land was strict about interactions between settlers and Native Americans, and many people viewed such friendships with suspicion or fear. One morning, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as he approached the cabin. John tensed, recognizing the uniform of the local sheriff. Naeli's eyes widened, and she instinctively stepped back. The sheriff dismounted and strode toward the cabin, his expression stern.
"John Whitaker," he called, his voice loud and commanding.
"What is the meaning of this? Why is this Apache girl staying here?" John stepped forward, keeping his voice calm. "She was in the river," he said. "I saved her life. She is my guest until the river comes. That is all." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You know the law," he said. "You can't harbor a Native American woman. It's not legal. Do you understand?" John nodded. "I understand the law," he said firmly.
"But she was in danger. She could have drowned."
"I couldn't just leave her." The sheriff frowned, but said nothing further.
He turned and rode away, leaving John and Naeli standing in the quiet morning light. Naeli exhaled slowly, relief flooding her face. She realized how close danger had come, and she began to understand that even after the river, the world held many threats she could not face alone. John reached out and gently touched her arm, offering reassurance. She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with gratitude. Over the following days, John and Naeli continued their routine. He worked the land, cared for the animals, and made sure she had everything she needed. She helped with chores, practiced speaking English, and drew pictures to tell stories of her life. Their days were filled with simple moments: collecting firewood, washing clothes in the river, sharing meals by the fire. But each moment carried weight. They had survived together, and now they lived together, learning to trust each other in a world that often mistrusted them both. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, John and Naeli sat by the river. The water glistened in the fading light, calm compared to the torrent that had swept her away. She dipped her hand into the cool water, letting it run through her fingers. John watched silently, sensing her connection to this river, the one that had almost taken her life but had also brought her to him. "You saved me," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. John nodded, smiling. "And you survived?" he replied. "We both did." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. For the first time, she spoke a full sentence in English. "Thank you." John felt a lump in his throat. There was no need for grand words. The gratitude in her voice and the strength in her gaze said everything. As weeks turned into months, John and Naeli faced more than just natural dangers. Prejudice, fear, and suspicion from the town grew, though John remained resolute. He knew that the law and the people might not understand the bond they shared, but he also knew that he could not turn her away. Naeli, in turn, began to trust him more fully. She laughed more freely, shared stories without fear, and allowed herself to rely on him for protection. One day, while they worked in the small garden, a group of townspeople walked by, staring and whispering. Naeli froze, but John stepped forward calmly. "Everything is fine," he said. The people mumbled and walked on, but the moment reminded them both that the outside world could be unkind. Still, they held on to their little world near the river, a world where kindness, courage, and trust mattered more than law or gossip. Despite the challenges, there were quiet joys. They shared meals, watched sunsets, and listened to the sounds of the river at night. John taught Naeli how to care for the cattle and use tools, while she taught him small skills from her own culture: how to identify edible plants, understand animal tracks, and move silently through the land. Their friendship became a partnership, each learning from the other, each respecting the other's strength and wisdom. Evenings often ended by the fire. They would sit in silence, the flames dancing and casting shadows on the walls, thinking about the world beyond the hills. They could not speak of everything, the outside world, the dangers, the law, but they shared what they could, and in that sharing they found comfort. John realized that Nayeli had changed him. Her courage, her intelligence, and her quiet strength had opened his eyes to a world larger than his ranch, a world filled with connection, trust, and respect. And Nayeli, who had always relied on herself, began to understand the value of trust. She realized that not all humans were a threat, that some could offer safety, kindness, and even friendship. She did not forget her people or her home, but she began to see that there was more than one way to survive, and that sometimes accepting help did not mean losing one's strength. In those weeks near the river, John and Nayeli discovered something rare and precious. Their bond was not just born of necessity or circumstance, it was built on courage, respect, and a shared experience that neither could forget. The river had taken Nayeli's life once, but it had also given them both a connection that went beyond words. As the days grew longer and the river slowly began to recede, both of them knew that changes were coming. The river would calm, but the outside world, with its laws and prejudices, would not wait. Still, for now, they had this time together, a time of learning, trust, and quiet friendship, and in that time, they found something neither had expected: hope. The days grew warmer as spring approached, and the river, once wild and dangerous, began to calm. John continued his work on the ranch, and Nayeli stayed close, helping with chores and exploring the land with cautious curiosity. Their bond had grown stronger over the weeks, and they shared quiet moments of laughter and learning. Yet even as the sun shone on the hills and the river flowed peacefully, a shadow lingered, a shadow that neither John nor Nayeli could ignore. Rumors had begun to spread through the nearby town. People whispered about the young Apache woman staying at John's cabin. Some were curious, others suspicious, and a few were openly hostile. In small towns, word traveled quickly, and news often grew exaggerated. By now, even those who had not seen Nayeli began to form opinions, fueled by prejudice and fear of what they did not understand. One morning, John was working with the cattle when he saw a rider approaching from the distant road. The man's uniform and the badge on his chest told John immediately that he was the sheriff. The rider's pace was steady and purposeful, and John's stomach tightened. He knew that the sheriff was not coming simply to enjoy the morning sun. When the sheriff arrived at the cabin, he dismounted and walked up with a determined stride. "John Whitaker," he called, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "We need to speak." John nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I understand," he said calmly. "What is it about?" The sheriff's eyes were cold and unyielding. "There are laws in this county," he said. "You cannot shelter a Native American woman. It is illegal. Do you understand what that means?" John straightened. "I saved her life," he said firmly. "Now, she was in the river. She could have drowned. I could not leave her there. She came willingly to my cabin. She is safe, and I am responsible for her." The sheriff's expression hardened. "The law does not concern itself with what you think is right or wrong. You are harboring someone in violation of the law. There will be a formal investigation. You will appear in court." Nayeli, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped back, fear in her eyes. She did not fully understand the words, but she felt the tension and the anger in the sheriff's voice. John moved closer to her, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be all right," he said softly. She nodded, though unease remained in her expression. In the days that followed, John received notices and letters from the local authorities. He was summoned to appear in court, accused of harboring a Native American woman against the law. The letters were formal but intimidating, filled with legal language that spoke of fines, penalties, and public disapproval. John knew the trial would be difficult. The townspeople's prejudice would influence the outcome, and the law of the land was strict. Yet, he did not waver. Nayeli's life had been at risk once. He could not allow her to be endangered again, even by the law itself. He began to prepare for the court proceedings. He gathered witnesses, neighbors who had seen him rescue Nayeli from the river, ranch hands who could testify to her voluntary presence at the cabin, and anyone who could vouch for her safety and well-being. John spent long hours writing letters and speaking with the lawyer he had hired, explaining the situation and hoping to convey the truth of what had happened. Meanwhile, Nayeli remained near the cabin, helping as best she could. She had grown more comfortable with John, trusting him not only for her safety, but also for guidance in a world she barely knew. She practiced speaking English every day, learning phrases and words that would help her communicate in court, if necessary. Though she was quiet by nature, she understood the importance of what was coming and the role she would have to play. Despite the looming trial, John and Nayeli found moments of normalcy. They worked the land together, collected water from the river, and tended to the animals. They laughed quietly at small mistakes, Nayeli dropping a basket of eggs, John fumbling with a rope, and these moments reminded them both that life could still hold joy even in difficult times. Yet beneath every smile, there was the unspoken tension of the law's scrutiny, a weight that pressed on both of them. The morning of the trial arrived, and the town seemed unusually quiet. People gathered near the courthouse, curious to see the case unfold. John and Nayeli walked together, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. The small gesture was a comfort to both, a silent promise that they would face whatever came together. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with formality and expectation. The judge, a stern man with sharp eyes, looked down from the bench. The sheriff presented the case, outlining the law and emphasizing the alleged violation. John's lawyer spoke in his defense, recounting the events of the river, the rescue, and Nayeli's voluntary presence at the cabin. Witnesses were called, each telling the story in their own way, describing the danger of the river and John's bravery in saving her life. Nayeli was called to speak. She rose slowly, her dark eyes scanning the room. She spoke carefully, her voice soft but clear. I was in the river," she said. "He saved me. I came to his cabin because I wanted to. I was afraid of the river, and I was alone. I am safe there."
He helped me. Her words were simple, but they carried weight.
The courtroom was silent, and even the judge seemed taken aback by her calm, honest testimony. Despite the compelling story, the law was rigid. The judge listened to all the arguments and witnesses, but ultimately had to consider the rules of the county. The law did not allow settlers to shelter Native Americans without proper permission. While John's actions were courageous, the legal system could not ignore the statute. The verdict was nuanced. John was not guilty of any crime that would require imprisonment, but restrictions were placed on his ability to house Nayeli openly. He was instructed to ensure that she did not remain at the cabin without proper authorization. John felt a mixture of relief and frustration. He had saved her life, and the court acknowledged the truth of that. Yet the law still limited their freedom. Nayeli, sitting beside him, looked at him with concern and sadness. She understood, even in simple English, that the world outside the river was not as kind or straightforward. After the trial, they returned to the cabin. The air felt heavy with unspoken words. John knew they had to be careful, but he also knew he could not abandon her. Nayeli's presence was not only a matter of law, but of survival and trust. He spent long hours thinking of ways to protect her, while staying within the limits set by the court. Nayeli, too, was learning the complexities of this world. She had relied on her people for guidance, and now she had to navigate a system she barely understood. Yet she trusted John completely, knowing he would do everything in his power to keep her safe. Together they planned their days carefully, avoiding unnecessary attention and making sure the cabin remained a place of safety and calm. Life became a careful balance between normal routines and constant vigilance. They worked together, laughed quietly, and shared meals, but always with an awareness of the outside world. The townspeople continued to watch and gossip, and the law remained a persistent shadow over their daily lives. Yet through it all, their bond grew stronger. The shared experience of danger, survival, and resilience had created a connection neither could ignore. John often reflected on the river, the moment that had changed both their lives forever. It had been violent and terrifying, yet it had also brought them together. Nayeli had shown courage beyond her years, and he had discovered a capacity for care and responsibility he had not known he possessed. Their friendship had deepened into something more profound, something that went beyond words or laws. And Nayeli, who had once relied solely on her own strength, now understood the value of trust and partnership. She learned that accepting help did not mean weakness. It meant wisdom and courage. She admired John's steadfastness, his integrity, and his willingness to face the law to protect her. Together they had faced the river, society, and the court, and they emerged stronger, though bound by the limitations of the world around them. As spring turned to early summer, John and Nayeli continued their careful life near the river. They cherished the quiet moments, the warmth of the sun, the gentle rustle of the trees, the sounds of the river flowing steadily past. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn, grow, and deepen their bond. They had survived the flood, the law, and the scrutiny of the town, and in doing so they had discovered a strength that neither had known they possessed. Though the legal restrictions remained, they refused to let them destroy the connection they had built. They communicated in secret, shared small moments of joy, and supported each other through the difficulties of daily life. Their story became one not just of survival, but of quiet courage, resilience, and the enduring power of trust and friendship.
Even as the world outside remained harsh and unforgiving, the cabin by the river became a sanctuary.
Here John and Nayeli found a sense of safety, belonging, and understanding that the law and prejudice could not fully take away. And though they knew the challenges ahead would only grow, they faced them together, united by the bond forged in the river's deadly currents and strengthened by every shared day since. The days following the trial were heavy with unease. The sun rose as it always did, but John felt the weight of the court's words pressing on him. Nayeli moved quietly around the cabin, careful not to disturb him. Both of them knew that the verdict, though formal and brief, carried consequences far beyond the courtroom. The law had spoken, and while John had not been sent to jail, the restrictions imposed were a silent chain that neither could ignore. The judge had ruled that John could no longer openly shelter Nayeli in his cabin without proper authorization. On paper, it was a minor technicality, but in reality, it was a barrier that threatened their growing bond. They could not live together freely, nor could they openly interact in the town without risk of scrutiny or punishment. It was as if the law had carved a line between their lives, one that neither courage nor affection could erase. John sat on the porch that morning, staring at the river that had changed their lives forever. Its waters were calm now, flowing gently over rocks and sand, but he could still remember the violent currents that had nearly claimed Naeli's life. The memory brought a shiver, but it also reminded him why he had acted without hesitation. She had needed him then, and she needed him still, even in the shadow of the law. Naeli approached quietly, carrying a basket of herbs she had gathered from the nearby woods. She set it down beside him and sat on the steps, her dark eyes watching the river as if it held answers she could not find elsewhere. John glanced at her, noticing the tension in her shoulders, the quiet worry that lingered in her gaze.
"We will figure this out," he said gently, trying to offer reassurance.
"The law may try to keep us apart, but it cannot take everything." She nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the basket of herbs. Her English was still limited, but she understood his meaning. Their lives had been upended by forces beyond their control. The river, the townspeople, the law, but they had survived together. That survival had created a bond deeper than fear, deeper than prejudice, and stronger than any decree on paper. The days that followed were a delicate balance of caution and care. John and Naeli continued their daily routines, tending to the garden, collecting water, and caring for the cattle. But they had to be careful. Any visitor, any traveler passing by could report them to the authorities. Even a casual conversation in town could draw attention and jeopardize their fragile peace. Every movement, every action had to be considered carefully. Despite the restrictions, John refused to abandon Naeli. He found ways to provide for her without breaking the law. He left supplies near the cabin when he had to travel to town, and they devised signals to communicate safely without drawing notice. Naeli, for her part, adapted quickly. She learned to move quietly, to blend into the environment, and to understand the subtle rules that governed this unfamiliar world. Together, they created a system that allowed them to live as safely and freely as possible under the circumstances. Even with these precautions, the emotional weight was heavy. Naeli often sat by the river, staring at the flowing water as if it could carry away her worries. She missed the freedom of her home, the familiarity of her people, and the life she had known before the river swept her into John's care. At the same time, she felt a quiet anger at the injustice of the world, the way laws and prejudice could limit what was right and fair. She had been saved, yet now she was confined in ways that seemed cruel. John understood her feelings more than she realized. He felt the same frustration, the same helplessness. The law had acknowledged his bravery, yet it still punished them both. He had saved a life, and yet the world treated that act as a crime to be corrected. He spent long nights thinking, planning, and hoping for a way to protect Naeli while staying within the confines of the law. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, John and Naeli sat quietly by the river. The water glimmered, reflecting the colors of the sky, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds settling for the night. John reached out and took Naeli's hand gently. "We may not be free to live openly," he said softly, "but we can still be together, in ways that matter." Naeli looked at him, her eyes dark and thoughtful. She understood. Words were not needed to convey the depth of her feelings. The river had brought them together. The law had tried to separate them, but their connection was beyond the reach of any decree. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent affirmation that she would stand by him no matter the obstacles. The restrictions of the law forced them to be creative, John found places in the hills and woods where they could meet without fear of being seen. They shared meals in secret, tended to the garden together, and talked for hours about life, dreams, and the world beyond the valley. These hidden moments became precious, more meaningful because they were fleeting. Every laugh, every shared glance, every whispered word carried the weight of what they had overcome. Despite the secrecy, life outside the cabin continued. Travelers passed by, gossip continued to spread, and the townspeople remained wary. John and Naeli had to navigate this landscape carefully, always aware that a misstep could bring scrutiny or danger. Yet even in this environment, they found ways to thrive. They grew stronger together, their bond tested and strengthened by adversity. John often reflected on the river, the trial, and the law. He knew that the world could be harsh and unfair, yet he also saw moments of kindness and understanding. Some townspeople had offered quiet support, acknowledging the courage it had taken to save a life. Others remained suspicious, but John learned to focus on what mattered: the safety and well-being of Naeli. Naeli, too, grew in confidence and resilience. She had faced death in the river, navigated a world she barely understood, and endured the scrutiny of a community that did not fully accept her. Through it all, she remained strong, graceful, and intelligent. She learned to adapt, to trust selectively, and to cherish the moments of connection that she shared with John. Even as they faced limitations, John and Naeli found small joys. They watched the seasons change, the wildflowers bloom, and the river flow with a steady rhythm. They laughed quietly at mistakes, shared stories of their pasts, and dreamed of a future where they could live without fear. These moments were simple yet profound, a reminder that life could still hold beauty even in the shadow of restrictions. As summer approached, the river became a place of reflection for both of them. They often walked along its banks, talking quietly or sitting in silence. The water reminded them of the day their lives had changed, of the courage it had taken to survive, and of the bond that had formed between them. It was a constant presence, a witness to their struggles, their triumphs, and their love that could not be fully expressed in words. John and Naeli also began to plan for the future, considering ways to navigate the legal restrictions while maintaining their connection. They thought about travel, letters, and careful communication, always mindful of the rules but determined not to let them destroy what they had. Every plan was tentative, every decision weighed carefully, but the effort itself strengthened their partnership. Through all of this, the cabin remained their sanctuary. Within its walls, they could be themselves, share meals, and enjoy moments of quiet comfort. The outside world pressed against them, but inside there was warmth, understanding, and safety. The fire in the hearth, the soft glow of lanterns, and the simple acts of care became symbols of resilience and hope. Despite the challenges, John and Naeli found courage in their bond. They had faced the river, the townspeople, and the law, and had emerged stronger. Each day together was a victory, each shared moment a triumph over fear and injustice. They had discovered that even when the law imposed limits, the human spirit could find ways to persevere, to protect, and to love. And so, life continued by the river, filled with quiet determination, careful planning, and deep, unspoken connection. John and Naeli faced the consequences of the court's decision, but they did so together, finding strength in their shared experiences. The world outside remained challenging, but they had created a small world of safety, trust, and understanding, one that no law could fully take away. In the end, the verdict of the court became more than a restriction. It was a test of their courage, a challenge to their resilience, and a reminder of the strength of their bond. Through careful planning, quiet courage, and unwavering trust in each other, John and Naeli continued to live, survive, and thrive. Their lives were intertwined, their souls bound by the shared experience of the river, the trial, and the quiet moments that defined their connection. Even with the law attempting to keep them apart, John and Naeli learned that some bonds could not be broken. Love, trust, and courage had formed a connection stronger than any decree, and that connection would carry them forward through every challenge that lay ahead. Summer had fully arrived, and the hills around John's cabin glowed under the golden sun. The river flowed calmly now, winding gently through the valley, its waters sparkling like glass. John and Naeli had learned to adapt to their new life, shaped by both freedom and limitation. The court's restrictions still loomed over them, but they had created a rhythm that allowed them to survive and, in their own way, thrive. Every morning they woke with the sun. John would tend to the cattle and check the fences, while Naeli worked in the garden, planting herbs, vegetables, and flowers. Though their tasks were ordinary, they carried a quiet joy. Simple things, watering plants, gathering firewood, or listening to the wind rustle through the trees, became meaningful moments, reminding them that life could be beautiful, even in hardship. They had developed a careful routine for communicating and spending time together. Some days they would meet secretly along the riverbank where no one could see them. They would sit quietly, listening to the gentle rush of the water and the distant songs of birds. Other days, John left supplies near the cabin while running errands in town, signaling with a small carved stick or a raised hand when it was safe for Naeli to come outside. Their lives were constrained, but their bond remained unbroken. Naeli's confidence grew steadily. She learned more English, allowing her to understand conversations in town and communicate more fully with John. She practiced reading the land, tracking animals, and recognizing the signs of the seasons. Though she still longed for the mountains of her home, she began to see the valley around John's cabin as a place of safety and even possibility. John, too, found strength and purpose in his relationship with Naeli. Her presence reminded him that life was about more than work and survival. It was about connection, compassion, and courage. He watched her with admiration as she adapted to a world that had once seemed foreign and dangerous. Her resilience and grace inspired him to continue, no matter the challenges. Despite their careful planning, life in the valley was never entirely free of danger or tension. Travelers sometimes passed by and watched the cabin, and whispers of curiosity or suspicion reached their ears. But John and Naeli had grown skilled at navigating these challenges. They moved cautiously, chose their moments wisely, and kept their bond strong through trust, patience, and understanding. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, John and Naeli sat by the river. The water glimmered in the fading light, reflecting the warm hues of the sky. John looked at her and smiled, noticing how the sunlight caught in her dark hair. "We've come a long way," he said quietly. "From the river to this?" Naeli nodded, a soft smile spreading across her face. She reached for a smooth stone and tossed it lightly into the water, watching the ripples spread. "I thank you," she said in English, her voice steady, "for saving me, for staying." John's heart swelled. Oh, words could not fully express the bond they shared, but he felt it in every gesture, every glance, every shared silence. "We saved each other," he said gently, "in our own way." Over time, they found ways to experience life beyond the cabin while remaining safe. They explored the hills and forest nearby, learning the secret trails and hidden clearings. They discovered wildflowers, berries, and quiet streams that reminded them of the beauty of the world outside. human laws and prejudices. Each discovery was a small adventure, a private joy that strengthened their connection and gave them hope for the future. Evenings often ended by the fire in the cabin. They would sit side by side, sharing small meals and quiet conversation. John would tell stories of his childhood, his days working the land, and the challenges he had faced alone. Nayeli, in turn, would share tales of her people, the mountains, and the traditions that shaped her life. Though she spoke slowly and carefully in English, John listened intently, fascinated by the richness of her world and the courage it had taken to survive. One evening, after a long day of work in the garden, Nayeli brought out a small bundle of dried herbs. She handed them to John, her fingers brushing his. "For health?" she said simply. John accepted the gift with gratitude, recognizing the care and thought behind it. It was a small gesture, but it held meaning far beyond its simplicity, a symbol of trust, friendship, and the quiet intimacy that had grown between them. The seasons continued to change, and with them came new challenges. Harsh winds in early autumn threatened the crops, and occasional travelers brought news from the town that reminded them both of the limitations imposed by law. Yet through every obstacle, they remained steadfast. Their bond had become a source of strength, a reminder that even when the world seemed unfair or hostile, they could rely on each other. They also discovered joy in small routines. They would rise early to watch the sunrise, noticing the first light touch the hills and the river. They would share simple meals together, laugh at small mistakes, and enjoy moments of silence filled with understanding. These routines became their anchor, giving them stability and comfort amid the uncertainties of the world outside. One afternoon, as they sat by the river collecting water, Nayeli spoke quietly. "I miss my people," she said. John nodded, understanding her words without needing more explanation. He knew she had left behind her family, her home, and the mountains that had shaped her life. "One day, maybe we can visit," he said gently, "when it is safe, when the law does not watch us." She nodded slowly, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Though the restrictions remained, the promise of the future gave them both courage. They had survived danger, prejudice, and the law, and they had done so together. The river, once a force of destruction, had become a symbol of life, connection, and resilience. As the year passed, their story became one of quiet endurance and courage. They faced each day with care and determination, finding beauty and meaning in their shared life. Their bond, forged in the chaos of the river and tested by the law, remained unbroken. It had become something neither of them could deny, a connection deeper than fear, stronger than prejudice, and enduring beyond the reach of any restriction. John often reflected on the river that had brought them together. He remembered the terror of that day, the icy water, and the force that had tried to sweep Nayeli away. Yet he also remembered the strength she had shown, the determination that had kept her alive. Their lives had changed forever in that moment, and though the law had attempted to shape their future, it could not erase the bond formed in those currents. Nayeli, too, reflected on her journey. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and a world she barely understood. She had learned to trust, to adapt, and to find safety in unexpected places. John had been her protector, guide, and companion, but he had also been her equal in courage. Together they had navigated a world of rules, expectations, and limitations, emerging stronger and more connected than ever. In the quiet moments, they dreamed of a future beyond the valley, a future where they could live openly, explore the world together, and share their lives without fear. Though the path was uncertain, the hope of that future kept them moving forward, sustaining them through each day of careful planning and quiet courage. As the sun set over the hills one evening, casting long shadows across the valley, John and Nayeli sat together by the river. The water sparkled in the fading light, reflecting their intertwined lives. John took her hand gently, feeling the warmth and strength that had grown between them. Nayeli leaned slightly toward him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. In that moment, the world outside, the laws, the whispers, the dangers, seemed distant. Here, in their small sanctuary by the river, they were free. And though they knew the challenges of the world would continue, they also knew something more important. Some bonds could not be broken. Love, trust, and courage had formed a connection stronger than any law or restriction. It was a connection that had survived the river, the scrutiny of the townspeople, and the judgment of the court. It was a connection that would carry them forward through every challenge and every quiet, precious moment that life brought their way. John and Nayeli had learned that freedom was not only a matter of law, but of the heart. They had discovered that courage, patience, and understanding could create a world of safety and connection. And in that discovery, they had found something rare and enduring, a bond that would last a lifetime, a love forged in the currents of the river and strengthened by the trials of life. As night fell, they sat together by the fire, listening to the soft murmur of the river nearby. The stars began to appear one by one, shining like tiny beacons in the dark sky. John and Nayeli watched in silence, sharing the quiet wonder of the world around them. In that silence, they felt the depth of their connection, the strength of their bond, and the enduring hope that had carried them through every challenge. The river would continue to flow, the seasons would change, and the world outside would remain unpredictable. Yet John and Nayeli had found something permanent, something unshakable. Their lives, forever intertwined, were a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of the human heart. And as they sat together hand in hand, watching the stars, they knew that no law, no prejudice, and no danger could ever truly separate them.